I last left off with Whyte's The Organization Man, the downfall of the Protestant ethic, and the rise of the social ethic. The belief, in brief, in stark contrast to the thrift, hard work, and independence of the Protestant ethic, that in order to eliminate conflict between the individual and society, the individual should submit himself to the group. To transition to the topic at hand, this transformation of values can perhaps best be encapsulated by the following two passages I previously covered. By the time of the First World War, the Protestant ethic had taken a shellacking from which it would never recover. Rugged individualism and hard work had done wonders for the people to whom God in his infinite wisdom had given control of society, but it hadn't done so well for everyone else. Emphasis on the social became the dominant current of U.S. thought. In a great outburst of curiosity, people became fascinated with the discovering of all the environmental pressures on the individual that previous philosophies had denied. The findings of such inquiries were deeply disillusioning at first, but with characteristic exuberance, Americans found a rainbow. Man might not be perfectible after all. But there was another dream, and now at least it seemed practical: the perfectibility of society. To move on, however, this is where Whyte turns to Scientism, the practical part of the social ethic. Scientism is the idea that, by using the same scientific methods that have been successful in the physical sciences, we can determine the conditions for human happiness and, through the process of social engineering, can solve even the most complex problems of human relationships. By the 1950s, according to Whyte, Scientism had already had a terrible record of achievement. Even its proponents admitted as much. But this did not deter them from their agenda, as we shall see, as Scientism was, and perhaps remains, yet another matter of utopian faith. Scientism was not a new phenomenon. It originated years earlier, for example, with the likes of René Descartes and the idea that, as Whyte writes, the discipline of mathematics could be extended to the affairs of man, even solving the problem of society, if only there were sufficient funds and time for the job. If only, Whyte emphasizes. In 100 variations, this promise has been phrased and rephrased, yet one would gather from current exhortations that we are just about starting from scratch, just the same. Current literature is full of dawn of discovery analogies: Balboa discovering the Pacific, Newton and the apple, etc. But it is precisely this figure of thought, this sense of being on the frontier, that gives Scientism so tremendous an appeal. Although it had not led to any real solutions before, its proponents believed that a breakthrough must be around the corner and clung to their utopian dream accordingly. And that should be of no surprise, at least in American terms, given that what we are discussing are matters of faith rather than the strict and systematic study of the real world through observation and testing against tangible evidence. Its adherents were not the kind wearing the stereotypical lab coat, but were rather the kind wearing the suit and tie. As a starting example of Scientism in his own time, Whyte references the then well-known merchandising consultant E.B. Weiss, and how he explained to readers that it isn't simply that such advances as electronic calculators and automatic factories are going to make for more efficiency. A whole new science, he says, is a building. And with the confusion between control of the physical and control of the mental, which is characteristic of believers in Scientism, he proclaims that the second industrial revolution will substitute the machine for the common, and for some fairly uncommon functions of the human mind. It is not his contention, he says in qualification, that the robot will replace all human endeavor, but almost all. After initial successes, such as cutting out the personal element in retail selling, making inventory taking automatic, the machine will advance into hitherto sacrosanct areas. And with what seems unwanted relish, he cites a scientist's prophecy that in time, the machine will replace man in the realm of reasoning and logical deduction. This is perhaps only one step away from the worldview of the technocrat of today and his or her religious obsession with the likes of transhumanism. But what we are dealing with in this passage from Whyte is not just a prediction, although we seem close to the point, at least in popular thought, in which the machine will replace humankind and its reasoning and logical deduction. This is the exact future influential figures of the past numerous decades have wanted to take place. and there has been no real ethical thought in the effort to replace humanity in such a manner, but rather a blind and fanatical drive. In short, the idea that we can solve the problems of man by completely and unilaterally changing him, perhaps even turning him into a machine himself, or by otherwise forcing him to submit to the organization or group, seems to have been a clear driving force in this country since at least the time in which Whyte was writing. Perhaps more important than any merchandising consultant, Whyte addresses how the field of public relations was susceptible to this same scientism, citing the Public Relations Journal. Now, whether he knows it or not, every practicing public relations man is an engineer too, a social engineer. He develops new relationships and operations in society, designs new organizations and institutions, sets up and lubricates the human machinery for getting things done. The challenge of social engineering in our time is like the challenge of technical engineering 50 years ago. If the first half of the 20th century was the era of technical engineers, the second half may well be the era of the social engineers. If you consider how the field of public relations grew in the first half of the 20th century, with corporate propagandists such as Ivy Lee and Edward Bernays, this idea is certainly disturbing. And whether or not they still consider themselves social engineers, the public relations field still continues to grow to this day. As Whyte continues, no matter what branch of social engineering a man is engaged in, mass communication, the engineering of consent, public relations, advertising, personnel counseling, he, the man of the managerial class, can feel himself part of a larger movement. And the reason for this is because scientism promises that such specialists can eventually be saviors. As Whyte adds, Thoreau once said, if you see a man approach you with the obvious intent of doing you good, you should run for your life. It is hard to restrain the impulse in talking with social engineers. Theirs is not a mere limited desire to help out a bit with the scientific method. The vision that energizes them is total and exclusive. Science is not merely a tool. It is the only path to salvation in a world where the laymen have gone mad. If the techniques are faulty, and this they admit, this is a matter of unfinished detail and insufficient funds, not principles. And no one should criticize until he offers a counter-utopia himself. The bottom line is that the social engineers of the 1950s and prior, working in their various corporate or bureaucratic roles, not only believed that they would be the future saviors of the world, but they also believed themselves to be beyond criticism. But it is not the study of man in society in of itself that is or was the problem, as Whyte emphasizes. Of course not. It was and is the premise that such all-encompassing solutions to society are inevitably just around the corner. It is the fact that such a deep hubris was, and still often enough continues to be, all wrapped up in the guise of an objective science. Indeed, as Whyte continues, part of the trouble lies in our newfound ability to measure more precisely, and the idea that the successes of natural science were due in large measure to the objectiveness of the phenomena studied eludes social engineers. We can certainly measure aspects of humanity, and even accurately. We can, as Whyte demonstrates, for example, determine the correlation between the median income level of families in an urban area and population density. But to the social engineer, the next step beckons. Having measured thus far, it seems that there is nothing that can't be measured. We are purged of bias, and somehow, by the sheer accumulation of such bias-free findings, we will have the basis of a theoretical formula that describes all, just like physics. With such an arrogant mindset, the social engineer further believed himself suited for scientifically determining good from evil. To Whyte, however, this inevitably leads to the question of, if such ethics or solutions could be so decided, who would be in charge of applying them to society? But he quickly leaves the question behind, pointing instead to how such quests are likely doomed to fail. The danger is not in science dominating man, and the fears of this rest on a false personalization of the inanimate, not to mention a romantic, if retrograde, longing for a past utopia. Nor need the specter of a scientific elite worry us. It need not worry us because a science of man cannot work in the way its believers think it can. But the gospel of scientism is no less important for that reason. To stretch a point, the trouble is not so much that these techniques work, but that they do not work. Schemes that don't work can have as much effect on society as schemes that do. Scientism asks that we make a compromise, but it can't deliver anything really in return. What I am arguing is that the real impact of scientism is upon our values. The danger, to put it another way, is not man being dominated, but man surrendering. The problem, of course, as Whyte adds himself, is that scientism had already infected society, enough to impact most Americans. And while we have since perhaps not entirely capitulated to the likes of scientism as of yet, far too many of our social elites, or those who are in many aspects already in control of society, still cleave to the likes of an exact science of man. But I will leave it off there for now, picking back up with Whyte as he answers the question, what kind of society is to be engineered? I hope to see you there.